Hello, I'm Janet Silver, and this is Top of Mind. With the rise of populism and an increase in polarization magnified by the pandemic, trust in democratically elected governments and democracy itself is eroding. In this series, we will talk about those threats, what makes for good governance, including the role of a professional, nonpartisan public service, and offer possible solutions to restore public trust in our institutions. Lori Turnbull is the director of the School of Public Administration and a professor at Dalhousie University in Halifax. For 2 years, from 2015 to 2017, she worked at the Privy Council office as a policy advisor and a departmental liaison. She has appeared before parliamentary committees and is often called upon by the media for her political insights. Lori, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lori, I'm just going to start off with the Top of Mind survey, which was of top executives in all three levels of government, and it was conducted last year in 2021. Given your unique vantage point, what overall stood out for you?
I think probably the overarching thing was the concern on the part of public servants, including senior executives, that not only is there a decline in trust in public institutions, but also that it really matters in terms of the ability of public servants to be able to do their jobs in order for governments to be able to see through, their policy goals and get them to fruition and actually have meaningful policy dialogue and then policy implementation and policy take-up, right, and legitimacy and things like that. Sometimes I think people think about public trust as a nice to have, right? Like it's good if people trust public institutions, but it's not like the end of the world if they don't. But it's problematic, particularly if the reasons that people don't trust them are based on misinformation, polarizing debates, and some of it that we see to an increasing degree, I think, in the past weeks and months. So I think that was what stood out for me, is that we really have potentially a crisis on our hands in terms of what to do about restoring public trust in institutions before things get worse. I think there are problems on the political side with respect to how politicians are acting as custodians of public interest. And really interesting part of the survey for me was thinking about how public servants can play a bigger role as custodians of public institutions in order to try to mitigate some of the damage that's being done by misinformation and polarizing debate.
You've raised so many points that I want to get to in this discussion with regards to misinformation, polarization, what those in the public service can do in terms of trust. But I just want to go back to the survey when all three levels of government, public servants in all three levels of government are concerned about the state of governance. Were you surprised that it affected every level of government?
No. So I think we used to see more, people used to when people were asked which level of government do you trust more, it was always the local level, right? Like people, and that might have been for a few reasons, because they're more accessible, they're closer to you, you might know them more, you might see them more, you might feel like you have more of an impact at the local level because there are fewer people and fewer votes, so your sense of political efficacy could be higher. And also there's the lack of political parties in most municipalities, so there's not the same partisan debate and the kind of government opposition, no overlap, it's sort of fighting all the time. We don't see that in the same way at the municipal level, so those things might encourage public trust. But we see now, I think, that all orders of government are concerned and are facing similar challenges with respect to their relationships with the public, even the local ones. I think COVID has been an interesting test for federalism in Canada and for relationships between governments and people, because it's exposed, how ready governments are for crisis. It is exposed whether or not governments are really ready to handle not only the crisis management, but the communication side of that. I think there's been an opportunity on a number of occasions during the COVID-19 pandemic for people to see governments at odds with one another, which really can create worry on the part of a citizen when you're hearing governments fight back and forth. And you think, why can't they just sort this out? I can see what needs to be done here is sorted out. So why can't the government see that?
I said off the top that you worked in the PCO from 2015 to 2017. I just want to go back to your time in the Privy Council office. Did you see during your time there a sense of trust declining in our institutions? And what were you hearing from the inside?
It's really interesting. So I was in the Privy Council office for the last part of Prime Minister Harper's mandate. And in October of 2015, as we know, Justin Trudeau and the Liberals took over. And at that time, that was definitely a change election. Harper had formed 3 back-to-back governments. People were looking for something else. And the election was really about, is it going to be Trudeau or is it going to be Mulcair? And at a certain point, and I think we can get into the implications of the 78-day campaign here, but at a certain point, it became, anybody but Harper, and now it's going to be Trudeau. And the rest of the campaign was really about him building a bigger majority. And so by the time he came in with 184 seats, there was a lightness in Ottawa, which I don't think was really necessarily because everybody loved Justin Trudeau. There was a sense of, we're going to turn the page now. We're going to do something different. The messaging from the Liberals was about sunny ways and growing the middle class and fixing what's wrong with institutions, right? So the Liberals started this conversation in a big way about fixing what was wrong, what was out of date, what was not working about some of the most fundamental institutions in Canada, including the public service, including the Senate, including the relationship between public servants and politicians and the electoral system. So when they came in and made the changes to the appointments to the Senate process, that seemed to happen very quickly and was not there was pushback. There was certainly pushback in the Senate, but it was something the Prime Minister could do through his own prerogative. There were changes made, that were transparent. It went through a process. People, and to the extent I think that people were aware of it, that didn't create a whole bunch of problems. It looked like the government was coming in and making good on a promise. Then came electoral reform, which was, I think, a significant problem for the Liberals once they decided not to go through with that. Even after they had made that very bold, clear promise around this is the last election on first past the post, then they did a whole process around that and said, well, you didn't reach a consensus, so we're not going to change it. So I think that was, in terms of trust, I think that Justin Trudeau lost a lot that day because he had made that promise. Nobody really pushed him on it. He made the promise. He brought a lot of NDP voters under the tent when he did that. He got the attention of young voters who are very concerned about the fairness in institutions. He really attracted a lot of support for that. And it seemed like it was sort of a politically noble thing to do because governments don't want to change the systems that elect them. So it was sort of like, oh, here's somebody offering a fresh perspective. Somebody who's saying, no, I'm not going to keep the status quo just because it works for me. But then he did what everybody else does. And so I think that was a big moment for a kind of collapse when people thought, oh, this isn't sunny, right? And then a few more things happened where it didn't seem that like some of the key promises weren't kept, like the boil water advisory. There was a lot of progress, but it didn't totally come to fruition. And then later when the Prime Minister had, although that's a continuing issue, when the Prime Minister had the issues with Ministers Wilson Raybould and Philpott over the SNC-Lavalin issue, that was a major hit for trust. The Prime Minister's various ethical scandals, including the photos of him wearing blackface. So I think that it's a consequence of the kind of politics we have now, where it's very concentrated in someone's brand. When that brand gets tarnished, all of the institutions get tarnished too. And so there's a liability there, right? Like there's a vulnerability of the institutions when we start to collapse into this kind of personalized politics that's about brand, celebrity, not so much about the systems themselves.
I want to go back because you said you started at the tail end of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper's government. And under his government, many in the media were doing stories with regards to not being able to access, or public servants, scientists couldn't speak to the media. And there was a lot of questions being raised as to whether or not their advice was actually even being listened to by the government. And I'm wondering, from being inside at the time and the change election, whether or not there was a sense within the public service, that they could, once again, give advice, that they could speak to the media, that they would have a voice inside, not only to implement whatever the policy of the day was, but to be able to give frank advice and to be heard.
So I think that was the hope at first, right? And I read, I think, similar things that you did around the reports of being muzzled, of not being able to really do your job, of the Harper government not valuing the policy capacity side of the public service, and that eroding over time because it wasn't valued, right? There was a sense that the prime minister and the Conservatives knew what they were doing, didn't need any help, thanks. And the public service was there to implement and to do the operational things, but there wasn't the same space for advice. And so then when the Liberals came in, I think that was the source of some of the positivity you could feel in the air in Ottawa, that, oh, there's going to be a change now. And again, this was one of the things that Trudeau talked about, was kind of really reinvigorating that role of the public service and reinvigorating our institutions. But I think it is fair to say, for me anyway, and I don't think that I'm not trying to speak for everybody here by any stretch of the imagination, I think there was some disappointment with how that promise actually came to fruition. Because one of the things too that the Liberal government campaigned on, and this was something that they made very public and as they came and took office, is this sort of deliverology public mandate letters, being very transparent about, here are the promises we've kept, and here are the ways that we've, here's what we're promising, here's what we've done, here's our schedule, here's our agenda and results, all very empirical, right? And this is kind of, again, part of the politics that we practice now, where parties are giving out messages and saying, here's what we promise, here's what it's going to cost, here's where we'll do it, and then we watch them tick off the boxes, sort of thing. Does that really leave a whole lot of space for public service advice? Not really, right? Because there's this sense that what parties are campaigning on, that's your contract with the public. And so you come in and you want to do what you want to do. There's also some, so I'm not sure, I guess, that the policy advice function has been any, greatly expanded under the Liberal government. They do government differently, for sure, but I'm not sure that it's led to any sort of increased value or space for the policy advice capacity of the public service. I would also say politicians are, I think, of all parties, are moving toward this model of, here's what we promise, we get it done. And so if we had another election that elected another government, I'm not sure that there would be an increased space for policy advice under that government either.
But what does that do to governance then? If the role of a senior executives within public service is to not only implement government's agenda, but be able to give, advice from a very experienced role, but that is not adhered to, how does that affect governance and the role of the public service?
Okay, so in a few ways. For one thing, the ministry, the prime minister and the cabinet set the tone, right? So again, regardless of what party is in power, we have an institutional infrastructure that puts a lot of power and accountability in the hands of the prime minister and cabinet. They are at the top of the departments. And so how the relationship is going to work between the prime minister and the cabinet and then the public service on the other side is very much set by the ministers, because they're the bosses. And so it's hard to sometimes to draw generalizations across, right? It's easy to do that in some ways because it's quicker, but it's hard when you really start to break it down. Ministers have different styles. There are some ministers that, depending on what the issues are in front of them, their comfort level with them, what their communication style is, what their personal style is, how much they're going to value the advice that they're getting from the public service, because the advice is there. And the advice comes in different forms, right? So we shouldn't think of it as this sort of, easy going back and forth where, oh, the public service gives advice and then the minister answers, and maybe the minister takes the advice and maybe they don't. It's more complicated than that, right? Where on the political side, the clock works much more quickly than it will on the public service side. So ministers are getting issues thrown at them. COVID is a prime example of how nobody could control that agenda. There was an emergency happening and it was evolving. And so ministers have to respond to that. And that's in an emergency time. Even in a regular time, the sense with which ministers want to deal with things very quickly because there's a political, the omnipresence of social media, somebody's always watching. They want to respond quickly and show that they're being responsive. Some of the value of the public service advice comes in the time it takes to compile thoughtful, objective, empirical, evidence-based advice and offer that. And so there's a disconnect always between how quickly the politicians want to move and the fact that public servants need time. Now that tension can be healthy. We, just give a little bit more time, right? Don't rush into a decision. It might be better, right? And and depending on the minister, depending on the government, they might really value the time it takes to come up with that positive, that frank advice. But sometimes there's not always the time to do that either. Although we did see in the COVID-19 period that when all other issues are cast aside and we say, here's what we need to drill down on right now, and you put, the minister and the chief health officials and the core COVID-19 response team in the cabinet, and then the relevant public health officials who are there to give that advice, when you absolutely create a cone around that and say, here's where governance is happening right now, it's in real time. So it's an emergency situation that showed that some of that kind of disconnect in the timeframes of the two sides of the relationship, that melts away in an emergency period. Then you see how quickly frank advice can come when everybody's focused on it. But that's not ordinary time. In ordinary time, there are competing priorities.
Okay, if I'm hired to do a job and part of my job involves giving advice, and yet it's either not accepted or ignored, or not even, I don't even get the opportunity to offer that advice. I just know me personally, I would start to feel pretty like, what's my role here? What am I doing? So I'm just wondering what that then does, not just to the morale, but for a good public service.
Yeah, it can. Well, so obviously it's not good, right? Like no one is going to keep offering the same thing with this, or even different things. No one is going to feel empowered and inspired to do their work if they feel that their work isn't having an effect. It doesn't matter what your work is. You're not going to want to do that, right? Like that's a terrible situation for a person, and it's a terrible situation for a team. It creates, I think, a lot of pressure on managers because they are trying to be responsive to the most senior public servants and give, they're trying to make that clock, give good products, give good advice. They're trying to deliver on that at the same time as they're trying to motivate teams that now feel pretty flattened. And so I think it can be really destabilizing for a public service. If there's a government that doesn't necessarily put a lot of value on that policy advice, they, over time, that might break down the policy advice, the quality of policy advice in the public service, because people are going to look for jobs elsewhere. People are going to want to do something else. If you are a critical thinker who wants to be, rewarded and empowered to give the advice that is true because you're an expert on this and you've done the work, you're not going to want to continue to plug it into a machine that doesn't want it. And so you'll go do something else. But I think also it can have the effect of really the system doesn't function as it should, right? Like if that policy advice isn't coming up because the minister needs it, they whether they have time to hear it or whether they want to hear it or not, they need that. They need to know that if there's an evidence-based reason why they shouldn't pursue a path, even if it's going to cost them politically, fine. Take the, if you're going to do something for political reasons or for other reasons, even though there's objective advice to say to the contrary, that's fine that's your call as a minister. That's why you're the minister. But do it with the knowledge that something else could come up, right? And so there are policy implications to, the policy advice not being plugged in the right ways, right? Like so the morale side is extremely important, and we need to think about that in terms of recruitment and retention. Also in terms of being able to recruit a more diverse public service. It's not good for recruitment exercises if the people who are in there already feel like this is not valuable work, but it also has effect for policy outcomes.
Lori, before we move on, I'd just like to get your input. There's been a lot written and said about the Trudeau government, that the power is very centralized to the Prime Minister's office. Yep. And I'm wondering if we take that as being a truth, if we accept that, then what does that mean then for the role of deputy ministers, other senior executives within the cabinet portfolio in terms of what they bring to the table, and that relationship in terms of their relationship with cabinet ministers as given everything would be controlled by the PMO?
Yeah, okay. So power being concentrated in the hands of the prime minister and the people around him, as we know, is not a new concept at all, right? Like, this has been well documented. And even, some people will point to the prime minister's father, the first prime minister Trudeau, of being when things really started to centralize, because he built up these central agencies around him and empowered the size of the PMO, the support around the PMO, and changed the cabinet committee system so that there was a more filtered decision-making process, and the larger cabinet became a bit more of a ratification system. And then you can trace different prime ministers over time to see how they handled that. But even if you compare somebody like Chrétien, who had a much more delegated style on some files, and it really allowed his ministers to own certain files as their own, like as compared to other prime ministers, for sure, you can still see how he held the files that were critical to him. And so every prime minister has shown a capacity to centralize power, and the institutions will back that up. So if you're a deputy minister who's working in the in the PCO, and you're kind of part of that central group, and that isn't just the prime minister. I mean, for this prime minister, it obviously includes the finance minister. There are people around him who he trusts, and that group of people is small. If you are a deputy minister or part of the public service team in that circle of people, I mean, your role is going to be one that has to be somewhat responsive to what the political side needs, or else the efforts of the deputy ministers are going to be kind of tone deaf, right, and offside. And you need to be in the conversation. And this might be a kind of, I'm going to say something that people are not going to agree with, and that some people will, so a lot of people won't, and that's okay. But I think during the SNC-Lavalin case, for example, we saw the actions of Michael Warnick, who was the clerk of the Privy Council at the time, and therefore the prime minister's deputy. We saw his actions, which we all heard about, because Jody Wilson-Raybould released a tape of a conversation that she had with Michael Warnick. His actions were viewed through a particular lens by most people, right? As, here's a public servant who's putting pressure on a minister, and that's inappropriate. And she's telling him that. And why would a public servant be acting this way? He was wrong. That's a lot of people who heard that tape had that reaction. But if you think about his actions as somebody who was inside that space, he is the secretary to cabinet. He is the only person who is going to have that kind of awareness of a conflict between two ministers, and be able to have the horizontal sight to be able to convene some conversation and say, well, this is what the minister's thinking. This is what the prime minister's thinking. You two are not on the same path right now, and we need to sort that out. He has a special role to be able to do that as the secretary to cabinet and the deputy to the prime minister. He's not some political staffer. He's not some junior staffer working in finance. He's the clerk. But people didn't see it that way. Right. But I think, in order to be responsive, in order to be relevant in the conversation, you have to say what you think. He was giving frank advice, but most people didn't see it that way. So when we get that close to the center of power, it's not pretty all the time.
I want to go back to something you were talking about before, and that was the federation and what we saw happen through the pandemic in terms of collaboration. Others would say perhaps the tail end, when we hit the second wave, that collaboration wasn't so strong. But I just want to do a bigger picture. First of all, how would you describe the federation over the past 20, 30 years?
So I think some of the things I would say you would probably be generalizable to other points in time too. But we've seen a lot of pressure on the provinces to deliver the expensive things that fall into their jurisdiction, like healthcare, at a time where that those files are becoming more expensive, more complex, more difficult to manage. We're seeing increasing pressure on the municipalities to respond to, and the provinces to respond to something like the housing crisis and how to manage affordable housing in different jurisdictions. Now we see something like the crisis in long-term care. There's a lot of pressure on provincial and municipal governments to deliver social programs. At the federal level, the approach of the Harper government was always an open, what Harper called open federalism, where the provinces are in charge of what they're in charge of. The federal government makes financial contributions, but otherwise stays out of the business of provincial government, which on the one hand, maybe you see that as a positive thing for the provinces, and that you don't have the federal government mowing your lawn all the time. But on the other hand, it could mean that if the federal government doesn't see more active, an active role for themselves, they don't give as much money. And so there's a push and pull between the federal government that says, here's a bunch of programs, here's a bunch of money, but we want it done this way, versus a federal government that says, no, that's okay, you can do what you want, and we're only giving a certain amount. So I think some provinces, depending on their own political culture, would have been happy under the Harper model, and also depending on how their own revenues were going. And then some would have been more happy under a more, robust federal government model. Trudeau's approach is very different than Harper's in that Trudeau wants to be involved in provincial jurisdiction a lot, right? And we see that with the recent childcare plan. We see that in a number of parts of the Liberal platform with respect to housing, with respect to health. The federal government wants to help you get a family doctor. We want to bring in a pharmacare program. And now with the deal with the NDP, we're going to bring in a dental program. The federal government is now getting really involved in social programs. But again, putting some strings on that. That will create tension with the provinces for sure. And also the whole experience of COVID-19, where, as you say, for a while, we saw a lot of cooperation in the real emergency period when everyone was afraid and it was new and we didn't have a vaccine and we didn't really know what we were dealing with. It was we're all in this together. But then when we got out of that initial phase, politics as usual started to creep up. Intergovernmental conflict and sparring that started to take over again. Relationships that had been fraught anyway, like the one between Trudeau and Jason Kenney, that became a little more problematic. So yeah, I think over time, as we saw that political détente dissipate, we saw more of the kind of what we are used to in intergovernmental relations, and that fray kind of come up again. But I think increasingly, as like something like affordable housing, everybody's talking about that, is going to take all orders of government to try to develop a solution. And so I think the ties that bind us are going to continue to be tested.
Do you think as a nation, though, we're more polarized than we were, say, 20, 30 years ago?
So I am not one of the people who think that we are increasingly fragmented in a way that is not going to be put back together. I don't think that we are experiencing the same thing as the United States, where it seems that the partisan lenses there do not overlap at all. And you have kind of two blocks with some undecided voters in the middle and not much of a consensus. I think there is evidence that Canada has a lot of consensus to work with. I think the compliance with COVID-19 measures, the rate of vaccine uptake, the broad support for some of the measures that the Liberals and the NDP have agreed to as part of their confidence and supply agreement, there is consensus about what is important. There's consensus about what we want to be doing as a country. Not everybody agrees, but there's some agreement there that would suggest, no, we're not totally fragmented. However, the discourse of politics is becoming more divisive. And even if you listen to the Conservative leadership race right now, some of the language that Pierre Poilievre, for example, is using is like, he says there's a gate, right? And some people are on the winning side of that, and some people are on the losing side. And the image of this gate means that there's really no prospect for social mobility. You can't change your circumstance. And then it kind of even suggests that, the system is working against you if you're not one of the wealthy people and you're being manipulated and taken advantage of in order for their success, their wealth to continue. And so you start talking like that. And even if there's widespread agreement on principles and values and programs, people don't feel that they're in it together. people feel that there's something going on, that they're not getting what they deserve out of the system, even though, you know what I mean? And so even if there's agreement between people on values and goals, there is a sense of a lack of social capital. There's a lack of trust between people. There's a lack of trust in the system. It takes us back to that point around people not trusting the system to deliver in ways that are fair and equitable. And so I think in that way, we are becoming fragmented, but not in core cultural values.
So if those populist messages by politicians, if you will, are helping in terms of the decline of trust in public institutions and democracy itself, then how do we address that with those politicians to change that? Because at the end of the day, we're seeing the decline in public institutions and democracy itself. And that's a very scary path to start going down.
Oh yeah, because when you think of like the different things that that a politician can do that are in the, you know, misbehavior, you know, not good behavior for a politician. There's lots of things in that bucket, right? And we usually think about corruption, right? Like using your public office in a way that is benefiting you privately or your friends or your family. That's usually held up as, this is what you can't do as a politician. You can't be stealing from people. You can't be using your position in a way that furthers your private interests over the public interest, right? That's usually the political crime. But now we are seeing something that I think is, to me, you know, this keeps me awake at night even more, because most politicians do not engage in corruption, even though sometimes we hear that, you know, we hear that kind of assumption. It doesn't apply to very many of them, actually. What we're seeing now is this kind of abdication of responsibility as a custodian of a public institution. Instead of understanding that your role as a politician, and even somebody who wants to be a leader of a party, you know, that you have to come to that with a level of humility, with a level of understanding that this isn't really your job. You don't have entitlement to this, right? Like, this is a privilege that you may get if you win, because enough people think that you deserve this position, and you have it with their trust, with their consent. And that's the only way to get it, right? You're not entitled on your own. Like, we see less of that kind of an attitude and more of a sense of entitlement over a job, and a sort of like, I will actually run the institution down and make people think that institutions are out to get them just because it could help me to win this seat. And so there's a sort of lack of responsibility, lack of custodial protection and ownership, you know, kind of like in a way that you're saying, look, I've got to pass this thing on to the next person, so I want to keep it in good shape. Right? If I inherited this role as a public official, as an elected official, what would I want? Right? Like, there's less, I think, awareness of making sure that that's kept intact, and more of a, I'm going to win at all costs. And if I have to convince you that, you know, the system is actually not fair, it's stacked against you, because that's going to make you trust me to come and fix the system for you. That is Trump-esque and irresponsible. And what is the right way to combat that, right? Because if all the politicians are doing it, or a lot of them are doing it, they're not able to hold one another to account, obviously, you know. And even if a politician calls out another politician for lying, it doesn't really have that much effect, it seems, because people, if people are losing trust, they're like, well, yeah, maybe he's lying, maybe she's lying. None of them is trusted enough to be able to kind of call the other out. And so there has to be some institutional mechanism that protects voters from that kind of misinformation and fabrication.
What is that institutional mechanism, though?
Yeah, I mean, so it's hard. Like, it's not, I don't think, to me, there's no silver bullet here. Like, it's not an easy thing to do. Any effort that is made at trying to legislate what people can say and not say, and even, you know, the federal government has tried to make it a crime to lie during a campaign, and to, you know, that was the changes to the Election Act that have now been struck down by a court, because it's hard, right? Like, how do you put regulations on speech without censoring? going too far. There's a sense that voters should be doing that. If a politician's lying, it's the voters that should be holding the person to account, right? And say, well, we don't want someone in politics who lies, so we won't vote for that person. Well, we know that doesn't work. And so I think instead of trying to say we're going to censor political speech, which would be a bad idea and it's not going to fly anyway, we have to build up intellectual self-defense. We have to increase civic education. We have to make it more obvious, to be able to tell the difference between truth and falsehood. And that way, even if the person isn't, called out by another politician or their speech isn't kind of impeded in any way, there's more of an awareness that no, that's not a compelling idea. I think that part of the trucker convoy, one of the implications of that is that we can see how much misinformation and disinformation and confusion and lack of awareness there is about our civic institutions. And so we need to build that up. And that, unfortunately, will take a long time and will require different mechanisms for different people. We don't all learn the same way. We don't all absorb information the same way. And so that's going to be a multi-pronged approach that I think there is a huge role for the public service, including election administrators, to play.
And coupled with that is the role of social media, which we see so much misinformation being spread on social media. And you raise an interesting point in terms of the echo chamber of, if I have a certain political view, I'm only going to click on, or most of the time will click on, those media that reinforces my own political beliefs.
Oh yeah. And that makes it so much worse, because you can, one of the ways that as a researcher, if you want to verify a claim, you look at a whole bunch of sources, right? Like I can go to 10 different journals and say, okay, 10 different people completed research projects and came up with the same conclusion, so it's got to be true. Well, if you put somebody on social media who is in an echo chamber and, well, I've heard the same thing from 20 different people, that must be true, right? Like it's a similar kind of approach, but now it's leading people to false conclusions rather than true conclusions, because you can get that false conclusion verified a whole bunch of ways, right? And so how do you get around that?
Is there a way, or should we figure out a way to hold politicians and those running for higher office, hold them to account when they have populist messages, or they're also spreading false information?
So I think, yes, I mean, I don't know how we do that in an official sense, or in a kind of formal, you go to jail kind of sense, right? Like that's not a reasonable thing, but there has to be, I think, again, like if people are educated about our civic institutions so that they're able to recognize much easier, much more quickly, when a politician is saying irresponsible things that are meant to sow discord and kind of run down trust, as opposed to tell me why I should vote for you. What are you campaigning on? So I think some of that is really in the hands of the voter to reject messages that are irresponsible more than they are responsible. There's a huge role for the media, because the media get to ask politicians direct questions. That's being compromised because sometimes politicians want to avoid that. So for instance, I don't mean to keep coming back to Polyev. I know I'm doing it, but there was a Globe and Mail journalist who put a tweet out the other day saying, Mr. Polyev, I've written you several times to talk to you about cryptocurrency, and you haven't returned my calls. Well, no, because Polyev, one of the things about social media is not only the echo chambers, but politicians now can very easily directly connect with voters. They can skip the mass media altogether. Some politicians, they want to talk to the media, right? Like it helps them boost their profile. Charest is doing that. He's doing meetings with a number of, high profile journalists to kind of build the momentum around his campaign. Polyev's doing the opposite and saying, nope, I'll talk to people directly myself. And so then you jump over that, that point where you actually do have to give account for what you're doing. So I can see one thing that could be helpful is to try to situate, how can we make more use of the relationship between politicians and the media? Now that it's been disrupted by social media, how can we kind of put that back to center stage? And that's cultural in some ways. What do we really expect the media to be doing, and how can we make shifts so that you can't avoid real questions, from journalists who will wait in line to come up to the mic and ask them. How can we resituate that so that politicians are more accountable on a daily basis for the things they say?
I just want to go back to one thing before we wrap up, and that is on April 7th, the federal government tabled its budget and mentioned strategic review savings. And I'm just wondering, going back specifically to the public service, are there savings to be found there as the government seemed to suggest in its budget?
I mean, if they decide they're going to go in and find savings, they'll find them. I mean, I think there's probably pieces of some of the programming that we saw during COVID-19, for example. They could probably go in and do a bit of a cleanup without disrupting, like they'll get enough savings, I think, to a certain extent, by cleaning up some of the programs that were designed for COVID. They seem to be saying they're not going to, they're not going to be cutting off departments, cutting off programs, firing people. Like that it sounds like it's more of we're going to go in and kind of tighten things up and clean things up so that we're able to come out with some savings. And given how much they've been spending over the past 2 years, that should be possible without a really drastic system of cuts. But that's going to be an interesting part. And of course, it makes the unions nervous. It makes the public servants nervous. As soon as you think somebody's coming around with their scissors, right? That's not a nice feeling. And so you're hoping they're not, coming for you, but they should be able to, I think, get through by tightening up without starting to kind of hack off parts of programs that people are planning to, relying on to continue.
Earlier you spoke about the pandemic and that there was some things that we learned during the pandemic. I'm wondering whether or not there were things that were applied that were learned during the pandemic that you would like to see implemented or continued going forward.
So I think there are times when the process that we have, we probably don't need it to be as long and, and multi-step as it is. COVID showed the ability of government to be more agile, be more responsive in the short term, to take a more, I think, outcome-centric and in-person-centric, like citizen-centric approach. But it requires too, for us to change our minds a little bit about what we expect from government. And so something like the CERB, for example, that was quick. They rolled it out the door very quickly. Departments dropped everything, worked together, focused on getting benefits to people, and they did. On the flip side of that, it means they're doing the verification later, right? They're erring, they're going on they're erring on the side of get it out the door. We'll fix the problems later. So when they fix the problems later, and some people have to pay the CERB back through their taxes because they got an extra payment, then we all yell and say, "Oh, the government messed that up." And you know what I mean? So like, if we want government to be more responsive and act more quickly, we have to be more forgiving when government cleans up the mess later. And so that's something that we'd have to change from a cultural perspective, because some of the process is around risk avoidance to make sure that the government doesn't have to say in 6 months, "Oh, we screwed that up." So one thing I can imagine is a different approach there, right? Where things are quickened up so that programs get out the door more quickly. But yeah, again, that'll require some forgiveness on our part when there are mistakes that have to be corrected later. Another thing is, I think we got used to a more transparent airing of, here are the reasons why we should do this, right? Like, and there are risks associated with that. There are risks for a public servant who all of a sudden is now giving his advice on television, right? Like, and, you can't really, when the public service, like when the chief medical health officer is out saying, here's what we should do and why, it becomes much more clear to the public that this is what the advice is. And so when a politician does something different, it puts the public servant in a really awkward spot, right? Like in my home province in Nova Scotia, we had 3 premiers over the course of COVID-19 and one Dr. Strang. And so Dr. Strang is I mean, he's out there giving his advice. People trust Dr. Strang. He's been, front and center this whole time. But you can see, with the comparison of the 3 premiers, that they aren't all the same. He's getting different. I mean, COVID is different now, but he gets a different approach from Premier Houston than he did from Premier McNeil. And so the transparency of all of that has some, kind of exposure implications for the public servant, and that he doesn't necessarily want to be answering those questions about why a premier didn't take his advice. Like, that's not easy. That's not supposed to be part of his job. But at the same time, I think people have gotten used to more transparency around what did the advice say? Where's the evidence for that? And so I don't think we have to be in emergency period all the time, but it wouldn't be bad if we continued with a little more of that, like, why are you doing what you're doing? And it fits with, I think, the rest of how society is evolving around show your math, show your work, where's the evidence, right? So evidence is good. It kind of, and it also helps, I think, in the trust side. There's a relationship there, right? Like, if people can hear this is what we're doing and why, they're more likely to trust it. If it's just, here's what we're doing, like, have fun, that there's less trust in that. We're seeing trust break down as politicians move away from public health advice. So there's a relationship there. There's something to learn.
I guess finally, Lori, going through the study, there's a lot of lessons to be learned in that study, the top of mind study, but what gives you hope that we could pull from that would give you hope for tomorrow?
I think where I'm hopeful is there is an acceptance of the need to do things differently. And there's a desire to do that. There's a desire to modernize. And sometimes I think for a while, when we talked about public service reform, modernization, we do that all the time, by the way. We've always been talking about how to make the public service better. And it's usually, how do we become more agile? How can we become more innovative? And then those become buzzwords that drive everybody crazy because they're tired of being, dragged through another reform and renewal exercise that says similar things. But if we start really talking about operationally, how could we behave differently, right? Like, how could we kind of take what we're doing and reorient it toward the needs of the public? Not just, making the public service better in some abstract sense, but how do we do the job of protecting the public interest better? And not just talking about service delivery, but also, what is the public servant's role in education? What is the public servant's role in getting people to understand why they can trust public institutions? That's really important at a time where politics is becoming more divisive. To think of the public service as maybe a strong port in a storm, I think, is maybe not the right way to put it, but a kind of reliable institution that is not driven by political outcomes, but is actually trying to do the best for you. That's reassuring.
Lori Turnbull, thank you for your time and your insights on this very timely topic.
Thank you too. Thanks for having me.
Top of Mind is a joint partnership between the Institute of Governance and the Brian Mulroney Institute of Government, sponsored by Syntax Strategic, a leading communications firm in Ottawa. I'm Janet Silver. Thank you for joining us.